All right, let's switch gears here on the Elias Macko Show and welcome Adam Zivo back onto the program. He's a columnist at the National Post, and he's the director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here.
Yes, Adam, great to talk to you here. Now listen, I take note of this because one of your post-media colleagues, Kalina Laframboise over at the Montreal Gazette, recently penned a story about fentanyl in Montreal and in Quebec. Of course, we're talking about fentanyl across the country now, thanks to Donald Trump, of all people. So, I know you've been covering this story for many, many years, coast to coast in this country. Let's break it down. Let's talk about opioid addiction and fentanyl specifically when it comes to Quebec and the rest of Canada. How should we start off here? How serious is fentanyl in Quebec, in Montreal?
Well, I mean, just as in any part of Canada, it is a significant problem in Quebec, but it's not as serious as it is in other provinces. Not nearly as bad as BC, of course, because BC is the epicenter of all of this, but also not as bad as Ontario. And part of that goes back to how Quebec handled the prescribing of opioids, because essentially our contemporary opioid epidemic really goes back to the late 90s, 2000s, when we had people overprescribing OxyContin, right? And that got people addicted, and then they transferred to heroin in the 2010s, and then transferred to fentanyl. Quebec was always a bit more responsible with its opioid prescribing, so it didn't have that same base of opioid addicts to eventually, move on to fentanyl. Other drugs were more important, like meth, for example. But of course, fentanyl is so fatal, and that even if it's not as bad as it is in Ontario, it still kills a huge number of people, and it's still something that should be on everyone's radar.
But I think what you just told us speaks volumes, huh? That things about how we treated pain decades ago and different approaches that we had here in Quebec versus other places. And we heard the stories from the States about how they were just handing out these opioid prescriptions left, right, and center for a very long time. It's interesting how those decisions 20 years ago can affect the situation on the streets in 2025.
Well, yeah. I mean, for example, Europe, in general, was also much more restrictive about its opioid prescribing, and they don't have nearly as bad of an opioid problem as we do. So decisions will really echo down over the course of decades in terms of our addiction policy, which is why we have to get it right. Because when we get it right, that saves lives not only today, but in a decade or two from now, right? It means saving the lives of our children.
And I was looking at a Health Canada report, and it said since 2016, we're basically at now 50,000 opioid deaths that we've seen in this country since 2016, right? And today, about 80% of those deaths are coming from fentanyl. So let's talk about that. And have we been sleepwalking into this? This is 2016 is a long time ago now. Did we sleepwalk into this crisis?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the problem is that we haven't taken it seriously. Because we haven't tried to actually clamp down on the illicit supply of drugs. We've been so focused on harm reduction that we forgot about the other pillars of an effective addiction strategy, right? So you need to have prevention, you need to have treatment, you need to have law enforcement. And those things were all put on the wayside. And the enforcement part is really important, right? Because when you have fentanyl dealers being able to traffic this lethal poison with impunity, then of course organized crime grows because people react to incentives or disincentives. And so we saw as criminal penalties decreased on the West Coast that fentanyl trafficking really proliferated. And of course that has an impact across the rest of the country because a lot of fentanyl that we see in Quebec, of course, comes from the West Coast. On top of that, even though we've had this, health crisis for almost 10 years now, it's been considered an emergency. Somehow, we don't have dedicated police officers checking the cargo coming in to the port of Vancouver. Fewer than 1% of shipping containers are checked. So it's really easy to get illicit drugs into Canada through Vancouver, or for example, the precursors, the chemical ingredients needed to make fentanyl. And it's astounding to me that something like this, which shouldn't cost a lot of money to fix, which shouldn't take a lot of effort to fix, has still not been fixed a decade into this problem.
With Adam Zivo, director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. Adam, I know you've been fighting this fight. I say fighting the good fight as well. Is it fair to say, though, that it took Donald Trump for the Canadian government to take this seriously?
Yes, I would say so because I think that, like, to a certain degree, Canadian politicians have understood that the opioid crisis is important. But at the same time, they focus so much on harm reduction, and Donald Trump really changed the channel here and talked about enforcement. And now we're seeing all of this conversation about enforcement that was completely absent 2 or 3 years ago. Now, that being said, the claims that Donald Trump is making, uh, around Canada, is not entirely accurate because he says that there's this flood of illicit Canadian fentanyl coming into the United States through the Canadian border. That's not true. I mean, look, 40 kilograms came in, and that's about 0.2% of what came in through Mexico, right?
Mm-hmm.
So compared to Mexico, we are a small fentanyl threat, but we're also an emerging one because we only started to become an exporting country recently because our fentanyl manufacturers in Canada saturated the market around 3, 4 years ago. So right now we're small. We may be a bigger, exporter in a few years. I think it's good that we're nipping it in the bud, but it's not nearly as bad as Donald Trump is trying to make it out to be.
For organized crime, have they made the calculation? In life, you just say you got to, what's the risk versus the reward? Have they made the calculation that production in Canada, there's lots of reward to be had and the risks just aren't that high?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, that seems pretty clear. But it's not just about our lax criminal justice system. It's also about international factors as well. And the most important one here is that China banned the production and export of fentanyl back in 2019 in response to pressure from the United States. But instead of that, what they did is that they used tax incentives to encourage their domestic industry to produce and export fentanyl precursors, which once again, those are the
Wow.
ingredients used to make fentanyl. Right.
Wow.
So these precursors come into Canada. So you had this giant hole in the market because China was no longer selling fentanyl throughout the world, but it was giving everyone else the tools to make fentanyl. And Canadian manufacturers, saw an opportunity and they
Yeah.
filled that gap. And within a few years, they saturated the market.
Adam, listen, we're going to have to leave it there. It's always a pleasure reading your words in the National Post on subjects like this. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Adam Zivo is a National Post columnist. He's also the director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy.